Welcome everyone now to Gods and Men Part 2, Communities of Thought. This follows on Part 1 of our lecture Gods and Men, which explores the burgeoning intellectual and philosophical and religious traditions of the first millennium BC. And so we look at here in part two communities of thought. One of the distinguishing characteristics of these new intellectual traditions was that they tended to occur not in simple isolation, but rather within a social fabric of dedicated followers and teachers who formed what we might call communities of thought. Few of the great thinkers were isolated, and most of them preached, taught, and prophesied to a community, as I say, of students or followers. So we've seen, for example, the image of Buddha's first sermon from the Kushan kingdom in the late first millennium BCE. This is at the point where the new Buddhist tradition, as you might call it, was taking root outside of its home in northern India, in places like the Kushan kingdom, which comprises parts of what is now, say, Afghanistan. And the Buddha is depicted here again, not in isolation, but rather surrounded by followers, by students, by scribes and others who will preserve his thoughts and teachings for the generations to come. Here we see a Renaissance era painting done by the great artist Raphael, who depicts Socrates, the great Greek thinker and philosopher, Socrates, cajoling, questioning his followers and passers-by and others in one of the most social of all Greek places, the Agora, or marketplace of Athens. Another image here from the ancient world shows one of Socrates' prize students, Plato, ensconced here in his famous academy, which became a gathering place for students and philosophers alike. So the great works of Plato created not in isolation, but within the social context of debate and dialogue and discussion and reflection with others. And then from the Christian scriptures or New Testament, Jesus of Nazareth, who was said to have attracted large crowds during the height of his ministry, the teachings of Jesus, preserved, of course, by schools of followers, disciples, apostles, all of them part of the social fabric of what would become early Christianity. So from the Buddha to the Greeks to the early Christians, these great traditions of thought, of philosophy, of religious teaching, all taking place within the social fabric of communities. These communities of thought stretched across Eurasia, knit loosely together by circuits of trade. It's no coincidence, for example, that, here in the Eastern Mediterranean, where we've charted the growth of trade and commerce and exchange, where peoples of different countries, of different continents, from Eurasia to Africa, found common connection through trade and commerce, and by and by saw not only goods and commodities, precious minerals, for example, or food crops or manufactured items exchanged and bartered in the marketplaces of the Eastern Mediterranean, but also ideas and philosophies and religious concepts and thoughts, then we're also part of that market connection. And we pull back here when we see the broader picture of Eurasia and Africa, and again, a kind of band of latitude here that stretches from China, sweeping really across Asia to the Mediterranean, covering parts of North Africa, that this was the great trade and travel zone of migratory merchants and sellers and wandering priests and philosophers who kind of cross-pollinate, you might say, the cultural context of this great region. And you can see here a kind of chronology that shows us in broader relief, again, when these various movements, religious and philosophical, appear in the historical map, from the beginnings of Judaism here in Southwest Asia in the 700s BCE, across a vast timeline of 7 or 8 centuries down to the time of the Roman Empire, and between them the rise of incredible systems of thought and teaching and preaching and scripture writing and philosophical debate and writing. Here you see from the regions of northern India, Siddhartha, in the beginnings of Buddhism. At roughly the same time, the work of Greek rationalists and mathematicians like Pythagoras, Confucius in China, and the Greeks again, the rationalist philosophers of Socrates' and Plato's day, to the great sort of Hellenistic Greek philosophers like Epicurus, and the great Chinese legalists like Han Faisi, Jesus of Nazareth at the time of the Roman Empire, part of a vibrant culture of preaching and prophesying. So an altogether rather busy, rather crowded calendar of ideas and exchanges that would come to imprint the world to our own day with the great religious and philosophical systems. Students, disciples, and followers, eager to write down the words of their heroes, their teachers, their prophets, to record their ideas, and in many cases these awestruck followers defined their teachers with awestruck reverence, sometimes even attributing to them divine status. Here a traditional Hebrew scribe with quill and scroll, working on a copy of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Here a different but related scene depicting Confucian scholars composing essays under the supervision of the Chinese emperor himself. So without these schools of followers, without these traditions of scribes who were committed to writing down the very sayings of and teachings of their own teacher, prophet, leaders, sages, committing them to scroll and with ink, preserving, therefore, the bodies of thought that would come to compose the philosophies and religions that over time would gather growing audiences and followers and forming into great intellectual and religious movements. It's interesting to think that Confucianism or Christianity or Greek philosophy didn't just arrive somehow full-bodied and ready to study. These traditions had to evolve, had to be constructed, edited, composed, compiled, and shared and revised and enhanced and abridged and added to over time. Which leaves historians with the question of how to deal, for example, after so much time with claims, for example, of divine truth in the case of religions. As Robert Strayer says, to put it mildly, religion has always been a sensitive subject, and no less so for historians than for anyone else. What do we make, after all, with the stories shared over generations of divine intervention, of miracles? Here you see an artist's depiction of the Hebrew prophet Moses and the famous burning bush through which God manifested his voice to Moses. Do we ascribe as historians literal historical truth to this? Well, as we've talked now for the past few weeks, historians are not in a position to make that sort of confirmation, although it's clear that even scriptural works like the Hebrew Bible have their own historical context. An article from a newspaper, for example, showing how archaeologists busy at work in Jerusalem, a city sacred to the Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions, how archaeologists have uncovered and excavated levels of that ancient city that go back 3,000 years to the reputed time of the biblical king Solomon, for example, and finding historical settings that would seem in the dust and dirt of an excavated archaeological site to suggest, in fact, that at roughly that same time as the biblical stories of Solomon, that in historical terms there was a Judaic state, and that there were the outlines, at least, of government and of rule. So can we find the bones of Solomon himself? Well, perhaps, though it's a tricky business, and even if archaeologists might, could that support, therefore, the supernatural claims of divine intervention and burning bushes? Well, not on the backs of historians it can't. Remember, history is an empirical discipline relying on tangible physical proof that can be studied and shared and confirmed and validated. So we leave it to the religious scholars and mystics and believers to deny or believe claims of miracle, but while we, on the other hand, as historians, continue the search for that which is historical. And so what does it mean, therefore, to treat religion as history? Well, it means to see the practice and spread of religion by human beings and the religious beliefs of people taking place within history, and that these beliefs and practices are subject to change over time. Historians, moreover, must take seriously claims of divine experience without having to somehow validate them as literally true, because they have been so often influential in history by those who do believe them. And yet, as I say, not incumbent then upon historians to validate or prove the substance of these claims, only to understand their historical influence. Historians need not take sides, in other words, in religious disputes, but rather understand how those disputes and conflicts have shaped history. Okay, so that is the end now of part 2, and with that we will continue into part 3 as we look at specific examples now of communities of thought and their influences on the development of civilization.